I'm Eddie Brumley. This is the book of Isaiah in 5 minutes, part 5.
In this video, we want to ask the question, who wrote the book of Isaiah? Very conservative scholars believe that the entire thing was not only written, but compiled by the prophet Isaiah himself. Even if you hold to this view, it becomes really apparent as you read it that Isaiah did not sit down and begin with chapter 1 and continue to write until he came to chapter 66. Instead, the book is more of an anthology, and the material is grouped more by subject and by tone than by chronology. And so reading it from chapter 1 to 66, you won't trace the life of Isaiah, but instead will find material that is put together because of the theme. Many scholars think that Isaiah had at least 2, if not 3, or even 4 authors or compilers who put the various sections of the book together. In the 11th century, Jewish scholars, and in the 19th century, Christian scholars began wondering if the same author who put together chapters 1 through 39 could be the same author who put chapters 40 through 66 together. The reason why is that chapters 1 through 39 seem to deal with things that were happening in the life and times of Isaiah. They take place during the 8th century, and they have to do with the impending crisis that is happening because of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires as they encroach westward upon Judah and her neighbors. There are many scholars who wonder, looking at chapters 40 through 66, if they could have possibly have been written by Isaiah. And the reason why is because they speak in detail about things that happened after the exile. And so in the 11th century and in the 19th century, Christian and Jewish scholars began to wonder if an 8th century prophet could really have known things that would happen 3 centuries later. Could he have known them in detail? Well, this is a philosophical question rather than an historical one, so I will leave that for you to decide, but we'll talk about some of the possibilities of how we got our current form of the book of Isaiah. Chapters 1 through 39 are sometimes referred to as First Isaiah and are presumed to be written and possibly compiled by Isaiah himself. They have primarily to do with warning the people of the dangers of breaking covenant with God, warning that it will leave them weak and vulnerable to an invasion by first the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians. In fact, the prophet Isaiah warned that it would happen, and he was instructed to write down his prediction, to seal this prediction, and to give it into the hands of his disciples, who would, after the event, verify that Isaiah had indeed predicted the Babylonian exile. This apparently happened, and it is why the Jewish community and the Christian community consider Isaiah an authentic prophet. I want to provide you with some possible hypotheses as to how we got the current book of Isaiah in its current form. The first hypothesis is that all of the material goes back to the prophet Isaiah, either directly or indirectly. Again, we see themes that are emphasized in one portion of the book, but they're not absent in the other parts. It has a cohesive message, and it makes sense in its current form. That said, Isaiah belonged to a prophetic family, and we know that he had a group of students around him, a school of prophecy, people who studied with him, learned with him, and who did their work with him, extended his work. And so they may have been involved. In fact, they probably were involved in the final composition of the book. The question is what role did they play? So what are the implications of these ideas for preaching and teaching? Well, I'll tell you, in preaching, I never use the terms 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. For one, as Brevard Childs tells us, the book in its current form has a cohesive message. And the themes that are prominent in chapters 1 through 39 are also found in small ways in the latter half of the book. And the themes that are found in 40 through 66 are found in smaller ways even in chapters 1 through 39. And whoever wrote or compiled the book had a cohesive message in mind. In teaching, I might spend some time on this, And what I would tell my students is that it gives us an idea of how our current book may have come together, how it may have been compiled. Chapters 24 through 27 are called by a very small minority of scholars the small or little apocalypse. This section is a series of judgments on the nations and a promise that through these judgments God will restore the nations ultimately, is claimed by some to be our earliest example of apocalyptic literature. Most scholars think that the material actually does go back to Isaiah and that it's not completely fully developed apocalyptic literature, but instead is what they would call proto-apocalyptic literature, or in other words, it gives us an idea of the origins of the literature that would later be called apocalyptic literature. Chapters 40 through 55 are sometimes called Second Isaiah. And the perspective of Second Isaiah is it's looking back to the past from the point of view after the exile, and is emphasizing that God indeed kept his promises to not only preserve the people through the exile, but to purify them and strengthen them so that they could continue to be God's chosen people. Chapters 56 through 66 are sometimes referred to as Third Isaiah. And the perspective of Third Isaiah is looking forward to the future and making the claim that the God of history, the same God who preserved and purified the people through the exile and has continued to work through them in the time after the exile, will continue to work through them so that through them they will be the instrument by which God restores all of the world, all the physical creation, and all of the nations. The first hypothesis is that the disciples around Isaiah put the anthology together that we currently have and called the Book of Isaiah. And the three distinct sections may simply represent three distinct time periods through which this material was being brought together. In the first part, before the exile, Isaiah's family and disciples may have simply been collecting the work and putting it together. After the exile, they began perhaps lumping parts of Isaiah's work together with other portions that had similarities, and they began to perhaps put it together in ways that made sense thematically. In a little bit later, as the process continued, we may have later disciples, maybe even descendants of Isaiah, who began to link these sections together, providing words of explanation, words of clarity, and perhaps even expounding upon what the meaning might be for the people living in their day. A final possibility is that a few generations later, there was still a school and a following of Isaiah, descendants perhaps even of Isaiah, who lived together, worked together, and continued to meditate upon, preserve, and continue the work of Isaiah. And they may have even been authorized to continue the work building upon what Isaiah had said in earlier times. And so perhaps the two latter sections of Isaiah reflect original work that they did, but that they felt was faithful and in continuation with what Isaiah had done and said earlier. And they may have felt like they were passing on and even continuing the tradition that was started in Isaiah. Well, I'll leave you to think through those possibilities. Did it all happen early, before Isaiah's death? And did Isaiah simply gather around him a group of workers that helped him compile his own work? And so did he oversee the analogy himself? Or do we have Isaiah's followers at three different time periods developing and collecting and putting the work together and then expanding upon it to provide explanations, maybe similar in the way that the gospel writers sometimes have to explain a geological location or have to explain a custom or a word or a name for their current writers? Or do we have the third possibility? Do we have students and descendants of Isaiah who continue to build upon Isaiah's work, thus giving us a collection that is more indirect in the way that it's related to Isaiah, but still builds upon his prophetic work? I'll leave you to decide that.
If you like what you saw, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe.